This is the CloudNout podcast, your launchpad for Amazon Web Services.
Hi everyone. On September the 24th, I've written a blog post on cloudonaut.io, and I was complaining about an issue that we encouraged with SNS. And because this got quite some traction, I'm now sharing this video with you because I want to explain what happened in the background a little bit and dive in a little bit more into detail. So my name is Andreas. I'm running cloudonaut together with my brother Michael. And besides cloudonaut, we also run a software as a service business, Marbot.io, which is a monitoring solution for AWS that works with Slack and Microsoft Teams. And yeah, I want to show you, explain the problem to you that we had with SNS recently. Okay, first of all, how does our software as a service product work? So one core aspect of the product is we are collecting all kinds of alarms from your AWS infrastructure. So this is something that happens in your own AWS account. And we forward that information, these events, we forward them to an API gateway that is running in our AWS account. The API gateway forwards that to Lambda, and then a lot of stuff happens with kinesis, step functions, and so on. This is another story that is not out of interest for that problem right now. So collecting, for example, CloudWatch alarms is something we do with CloudWatch alarms, and then having an SNS topic that forwards those incoming alarms to our API gateway. So we use SNS, probably something that a lot of you do as well, to forward CloudWatch alarms to any kind of endpoints, email, or what have you. We use so-called HTTP subscriptions for SNS. So the SNS topic has a subscription of type HTTPS, and this integration forwards the messages to our backend. So that's how everything works. And on September the 1st, a customer of ours wrote in and complained about that they were seeing extreme delays in the alarms from their AWS infrastructure until they show up in Slack. So the delay was more than 30 minutes. This is totally unacceptable for our product, because what we want to do is we want to notify you immediately when something goes wrong in your AWS infrastructure. So I started investigating, and I want to take you on that journey a little bit. So first of all, when something is not working on AWS, you can have a look at the AWS Health dashboard, or Service Health dashboard, how is it called? And there you will find all the AWS services in all the different regions and their current state. And of course, typically problems do not show up here. So when I search for simple notification service, everything is in services operating normally. So everything is fine from AWS's perspective. Okay, fine. So I needed to dive further into that. What I did next I checked our logs on the API gateway, because I wanted to find out where does the delay happen. So first of all, I suspected our own infrastructure. So I checked our API gateway logs and tried to find out the delay from the incoming alarm at the API gateway to the time when we forward or deliver that to Slack or Microsoft Teams. And by going through all our logs and having a look at everything that happens in there, I found out that there is only a very little delay of milliseconds or seconds in place there. So the problem was not on our side of the infrastructure. And that is why next I had a look into what can go wrong on the other side. So in the AWS account of our customer. And my idea was that something needs to be wrong with the SNS configuration. And that's what I had a look at next. And I want to show you how I did that, because you can do the same in case you are wondering whether you are affected by that issue with SNS HTTPS subscriptions. Okay, so let's jump to the AWS Management Console. There you find all the topics that we have in here, and one of these topics is the so-called Marburg alert topic. And this is the topic we use to send CloudWatch alarms to and then forward those to our API gateway. And our customers do the same. Basically, they use the same templates, CloudFormation and Terraform, to set up the topic and the alarms. Luckily, what we had enabled for the SNS topic already is something that is called delivery status logging. So I don't know if you're aware of that. I haven't been aware of that before this issue. So that's basically a way to log all the delivery attempts from SNS to CloudWatch logs, so that you get insight into what's happening there. And this was very helpful for debugging the situation. So check your SNS topics and see if you have already enabled the delivery status logging. If not, I recommend you to do so, because that really helps you to debug issues whenever a message gets lost or gets delayed from SNS to one of your endpoints. So highly recommended. Okay, SNS sends information about the delivery status of each message to a CloudWatch log group. And I like to use CloudWatch Logs Insights to search through the data. So that is what I want to do here. So I selected the CloudWatch log group of the SNS topic. And when you go to fields, you can find all the attributes of the log messages that CloudWatch Logs Insights detected automatically. And there's something interesting here, which is called delivery dwell time in milliseconds. So this is basically the time a message sits inside the SNS service until it is delivered to your endpoint. And this is the thing where it gets interesting here. So let me run that query. I'm searching through the last 12 hours of data from our own SNS topic. So, and we will check the dwell time. So the delay actually it took SNS to deliver the message. And the interesting thing here is you can see some of the messages, maybe half of them, have very high dwell times here. So let me quickly convert that. So this is in milliseconds, and it's always hard to read that. So this is about 20 minutes, for example. So this example is about 20 minutes, but we have worse situations in here. Let's convert that quickly, where we have, this is over 2 hours. So it took SNS over 2 hours to deliver the message. Another interesting aspect here is SNS also counts the delivery attempts, so that the times it tried to deliver the message. Let's add that to the query as well, quickly. And what you can see here, it only attempted to deliver the message once. So there was nothing happening on our side, the API gateway. There was no message rejected, server-side error or throttling or something like that. SNS tried once, but it took something between 20 minutes and 2 hours in the worst case to deliver the messages. So there's clearly something going wrong on the SNS topic side. And with that information, I created an AWS support case, because now it was very clear to me that there was an issue happening on the side of AWS. And unfortunately, the story does not end here because, when you create an AWS support case, the support engineer tries to understand what's going on. There was a little bit back and forth between the two of us. And then finally, the problem was forwarded to the service team, or at least that's what the support engineer promised me to do. And then it took weeks and weeks and nothing happened. So even until today, the problem is not fixed yet. So we still observe that problem in the wild. And it took quite a long time until I got until AWS really told me they are working on that problem. So that was the most frustrating thing for me, because as I told you at the beginning, our business is affected by that, because the messages, the alarms from some of our customers are really delayed until they show up on Slack and Microsoft Teams because of that. And this is an issue. This impacts our business. And I expect a public cloud provider to act on such problems much quicker than that. Yeah, so I've written a blog post, and this was shared a lot, and I got some traction. And then AWS finally contacted me and started a process and described what happened to me and what's going on. And so the feedback to that blog post, some even didn't believe me. So I got a lot of feedback. You don't know how AWS works. Go away, something like that. But luckily, even AWS now, so Jeff Barr posted on Reddit the response from the service team, so that is now public information I can share with you. So there is an issue with SNS. It is affecting HTTP and HTTPS subscriptions. Jeff Barr says it only affects a very small amount of SNS topics and their subscriptions. That might be true. I don't know. I cannot verify. We see that with our customers. I don't know if it happens where it happens elsewhere. Maybe not that many customers are using that feature. The problem is SNS comes with a throttling feature. So not the server side, not the API gateway on our side throttles requests, but the SNS topic, the subscription, can throttle the throughput to an endpoint as well. So that is a feature of SNS. You can define something that is called max receives per second. And by doing that, you can make sure that you're not overwhelming your endpoint. Yeah? So that is something we have configured for the SNS topics we are setting up in our customers' accounts to make sure they're not flooding our backends with useless information. And we don't expect more than one message per second because it is a monitoring system for humans. So we don't believe that humans can process more than one message per second. So that is why we choose that. Okay, and the problem is, Jeff Barr describes it here, that there is an issue with that throttling mechanism. And this problem adds the delay to the message delivery. Yeah. So the workaround is to remove the throttling from your SNS subscriptions. And I want to quickly show you how to do that in case you are affected by that issue as well. So there are two places where this can happen. One is at the topic level and the other is at the subscription level. So let me open that up. So there is the delivery retry policy that you can use to define how does SNS retry deliveries to HTTP, HTTPS endpoints. You can define it here. I haven't. You can do the same at the subscription level and basically override what is defined at the topic level. And this is where we have configured that for our own subscription, but also for those of our customers. And you can find here the throttle policy, and it says max receives per second 1. So this is configuring the throttling mechanism of SNS. And if you remove that, then that's basically the workaround for the delay, because then the issue is no longer affecting the message delivery for your subscription or topic. So by removing that, you can fix the issue. Yeah, so that's the story. So there is a workaround, but now the problem for us is, so we have many customers that are using that setup, and all of those customers have probably used either our CloudFormation, Terraform, or they're going through it manually and set up their own SNS topics and subscriptions in their own account. So we don't have control over that. So we have now to communicate to our customers that they need to take action and reconfigure their SNS topics. Luckily, we have something built in that can inform our customers when they are using our CloudFormation or Terraform templates. But for those who have done that manually, of course, there is no such mechanism in place. So the customers have to do that manually as well. So that's a lot of effort, a lot of support requests that are coming in. And what really strikes me here is that AWS hasn't fixed that problem yet. So we reported that more than 24 days ago now. And what's even more of an issue is So as I told you, there is that post from Jeff Barr, and here he says they are expecting to deliver a solution, a fix to that problem by the end of October. So this is another month until they plan to fix that problem for all customers. So that's quite a lot of time for fixing such a thing that is affecting our production workloads. So I'm not really happy with that performance. So first of all, I think AWS should have noticed far faster that there is an issue here and that they need to take action, and not me having to write a blog post that points them to that problem. And on the other side, I'm a little bit frustrated on how long it takes to fix the problem finally. Of course, there's a workaround, and many customers can use that. So if that's your own AWS account, you can easily reconfigure them. But for all situations where those topics are part of other AWS accounts, the problem is even worse. And I think we really like serverless architectures, and as you know, we are big fans of AWS as well. But yeah, this was really a really bad experience, and I was losing trust a little bit in AWS for providing reliable service here. Yeah, so that's the story from our side. And if you have any questions, so community.cloudonaut.io is where you find a topic for this video where you can post your questions, share your thoughts, and discuss with us. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I would appreciate if you could share your feedback with me. So yeah, do it on community.cloudonaut.io, send me a message on Twitter or via email. I'm happy to hear from you. Thanks for listening and watching. Bye.